You guys remember? So those of you who were here, it was a very lively discussion. I actually couldn't stop you talking. Because everyone was talking, everyone was asking questions, everyone had something to offer. It was quite diverse, it was very interesting. And but sometimes we come across passages like that just stir a whirlwind of thoughts and ideas in our mind. And sometimes we have things that are kind of been brewing there for a while. So it becomes an occasion for us to talk about it. It becomes an occasion for us to get it out. So I call this teaching Unity and Diversity and Good News for Jews, Greeks, and Barbarians. Why? Because that's what I think Book of Romans is really about. It is really about unity of Jews and non-Jews in their diversity, being who they are. And it is about good news that allows us for that unity. So, and the reason, of course, why I have the picture of this dark-looking cave in there is my attempt at poking connection at Plato's allegory of the cave. So you've heard my story about that. So let's review what we talked about last time. So last time in the chapters that we've been studying, and Shaul's letter to the Romans is a complicated one. It's a rhetorical piece. You have to realize he's writing a letter. He's writing it in the style of Greek literature, in the way that people wrote letters back in those days. But being the rabbi that he is, he's going to teach a whole bunch of spiritual ideas, and he's challenged to teach it to people who know things and people who don't know things. Of course, Jews know the scripture, and he'll quote it all the time. And then non-Jews have no idea what he's talking about, so he leans more on human understanding, as sometimes he says. He would say occasionally, I speak from logic, or I speak in a human way. You hear him say that from time to time, because he just goes off into these logical ideas. All right, so what is this good news for Jews, Greeks, and barbarians? And this is Shaul's good news. If you ever want to understand what Shaul's good news is, it's actually, he spells it out there in the book of Romans. He just doesn't do it in such a concise way. So, here it is. First is that there's justification, being made righteous. This is something that happens with us and God, and this process of us being made righteous is a gift. It's a gift of God's grace. Hashem gives it to us. It's not something we earn. And he's going to actually belabor that point for a little while in the next chapter. So he says this gift is possible through Yeshua's redemption. So if you want to know how this gift comes to you, it comes through what Yeshua has done. And we talked about redemption. The idea of redemption is purchase or a payment, a kofer, a ransom, something that has been paid for a person who is not free, a person who cannot benefit from it. He's not free to use these things. And redemption is like being bought out of a slave market. Not to say that we're all slaves, but in the sense that in some ways, we're not free. We're not free from the fact that we have a power of sin in our life that we can't seem to shake off. In a sense, we struggle with disobedience. And in that place, we all find ourselves united in the fact that we all, together, in a united way, cannot obey God. So redemption through Yeshua is what allows us to have that gift of justification, being declared righteous, being called righteous. And then Shaul talks about Yeshua's blood, or his death, and how God publicly displayed that as a covering, as a kaporet. That's what this idea of redemption and cleansing is all about. The image is of cleansing image from a Levitical system that we study every time we go through one of the books of the Torah. We look at this in detail. So then Shaul says God demonstrated his righteousness as a judge now, at this moment, because of his patience concerning the previously passed over sins. So in a sense, what he says is God has been holding back on giving us the punishment that is due. He's been holding it back, and now he can act as a judge because this is the right time. Something has happened. He tells us all of us has sinned, but now we have redemption. Now we have a cleansing, a kaporet, a covering. And that now God can act as a judge. Why? Because there is an advocate. There is a justification that happens. So, and then point number 5, Shaul says that in doing so, God is just, meaning he's going to do what is right. As a judge who judges, he is dispensing justice. And at the same time, he is a justifier who sent Yeshua. He's the one who gives you that righteousness. He gives you righteousness, but at the same time, he judges you, and he finds you righteous. And why? All of that, the good news part, is that he has sent Yeshua to allow us to have this gift, this redemption. Otherwise, that gift would not be there. So God is merciful, he's kind, and that's what he's done. And that's the good news that Shaul is explaining to the Jews, Greeks, and barbarians. This is something that he understood himself, and now he's trying to relate that in his letter in Romans. So anyway, that's my, if you haven't figured this out, that's my summary pretty much of the earlier chapter there. So last time we stopped at Romans chapter 3. We got to the very, very end. So Romans chapter 3, verses 27, 28. He says, all of us have sinned. What do? All of us have found our way under sin. And then he says, where is then boasting? Boasting. You can boast when you have something to boast about. He says, it is excluded. By what kind of law? Of works? No, by the law of faith. For we maintain that man is justified by faith or by faithfulness apart from the works or the deeds of the law. Now, this is one of those statements that has been so misunderstood. And the reason why it's misunderstood is because people take the simplicity of what it says and kind of stretch it to fit whatever they think it says. So what is this law of works or deeds? And what is this law of faith or faithfulness? We have to unravel this because Shaul speaks in his own little code language sometimes. He says these things. He doesn't always explain them. So we have to think about it for just a moment. And I wanted to tell you a secret. And the secret is that most translators of ancient Greek know. Secret is actually very simple and people should know it. The term law, as is expressed in Greek, nomos, does not always mean Torah. It does not always mean that. Sometimes it means something else. Sometimes it means a rule. Sometimes it means a custom. Sometimes it means a principle or a system or a procedure or a pattern or precedent and a few other similar options. It's like this. It's like, think of it this way. The term law can be used in the same way we use the word law in English. Law is its most basic, most literal, most straightforward meaning. It's the concept of the word nomos, how it's expressed in Greek. But we use the word law even in colloquial English language in all kinds of ways. Like, for example, we talk about laws of gravity, right? Something like that. Is that an actual law? Think about it. Is the law of gravity an actual law? Did somebody have to come up with it and put it in the books? Is that something that plays out in the courtroom? No, it's a principle. If you throw it in the air, it's going to go up for a distance and then land back. It's a law because it's something that how it works. It's a law because we should expect for it to function. If I throw a rock, it is not going to keep flying indefinitely. It is going to land. So that's gravity, right? So we have law of this and law of that. We have lots of laws in the society. In a sense, you could say we can have lots of rules or customs or principles or precedents or patterns. The world works according to its laws, whatever those laws are, and guess what? It's not Torah always. Because Torah is something else. In fact, translating the word Torah as law is a very, very narrow definition. Okay, Torah means teaching, instruction, right? That's what it means. So the big secret that I'm trying to tell you is that most people know that whenever they encounter the Greek word nomos in the text like this, they know it doesn't always mean Torah. Sometimes it just means something else, like a principle or a system or a pattern or rule, and so that makes our job translating these things a little bit harder because we have to think, how did Paul mean that? What did he try to say by that? So That's why reading it in context becomes very, very important. Because guess what? As we read further in Romans, he's going to start switching the meanings of those words on us. And if you don't catch on to the fact that he just switched from a very specific meaning to a very generic meaning, you are most likely to misinterpret the verse you're reading. Why? Because the whole time you're thinking, oh, it's this. Well, actually, it's not. It's that. And you're looking at the English translation thinking that the translators have done a good job. And maybe they have most of the time, but they're people. Sometimes their own ideas, their own commitments to their religious ideas leads them in a direction to make the decisions that they do. Remember, I told you last time, people translate the way they believe. What you believe is what makes you see what you see in a text, and therefore you translate it that way. Last time I presented a passage for you to show to you how difficult it is to translate it, and how, depending on what you believe, you are going to be wanting to translate it one way and not the other way. And then the other people in the crowd, because of what they believe, they're going to want to translate it that way and not this way. And both of them are going to argue, and it's because there's room in that text for it to be translated that way or another way. And that's why different translations differ. So that was the whole experiment that I showed to you like that. And there are other places like this and there are other passages throughout the Bible where you have to be cognizant of the fact that translators are translating, but sometimes they're translating because that's what's in their mind. So sometimes Shaul uses the term nomos in a very specific sense as Torah, and other times in a generic sense. Especially in his letter in Romans, in fact, he will use it in multiple ways. And hopefully I'll be able to point it out to you when we get to that. Now, in fact, I'm going to tell you this. It works the same way in Hebrew, by the way. Not as frequent. But there are a few examples where a word like nomos expresses a broad idea of a principle, a rule, or a system that does in Greek. It does the same thing with the word Torah in Hebrew. It could do the same, essentially. So at times it refers to general pattern, like a principle, and not to God's laws, teachings, or instructions. So do you know that there are possibilities that sometimes when you read the word Torah, it doesn't really mean Torah as in 5 books of Moses. It just means generally instruction. Like, for example, in Proverbs, listen to your mother. Mother's what? Teaching, instruction. It uses actually the word Torah there. But so you're supposed to listen to your mother's Torah, or you're supposed to listen to your mother's instruction? What it means is listen to what your parents tell you. The parental instruction is actually meaningful. Not that parental instructions are as good or the same as the revelation that Moses received on Sinai. That's not what it says. But you will see that from time to time. But here's an example that I want you to see that's very obvious. We're talking about something human here. This is 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 18 through 19. I'm just trying to illustrate to you that sometimes the Hebrew Bible does the same as what Paul is doing. So then David, the king, went and sat before the Lord, and he said, "Who am I, O Lord God, and what is my house that you have brought me this far? And yet this was insignificant in your eyes, O Lord God, for you have spoken also to the house of your servant concerning the distant future. And this is the custom of man, O Lord God." So look at what Hebrew says. It says, "Vizot Torot ha'adam." Literally, if I was to translate it as the word Torah, I would say, and these are the Torahs of mankind, O Lord God. Such is the custom of man. That's what he says. So he says, this is how people are. This is how they operate. This is the principle of how it works. That's what he's saying. So he uses the word Torah here in plural sense, by the way, and he uses it in a very generic way. And this is 2 Samuel. So there are other places scattered throughout the Hebrew Bible that kind of do more or less the same. What I want you to see is that this happens in Greek, this happens in Hebrew, it happens in languages in general. That there's a specific meaning of the word that's very narrow, and there's a more generic meaning of a word. And we have to be careful not to get lost. So the question that every reader in Romans should answer when Shaul says law of works or law of faith, does he have Torah on his mind, or is this a more generic sense of the word nomos, like principle of works or rule of faith? That's a question you have to answer. I'm not even sure I can answer it for you. I mean, I can make a case for it, but then we can disagree and turn it into an argument. I don't want to do that. I want to put out the information in front of you and let you read through the passage yourself and think it through and allow the possibilities of different meanings that you may have allowed before to be in your head as you read through it. Will it make sense to you more? Will it click better in your head if you read that as a principle of works, a principle of faith rather than a law of faith or something like that? Because the word Torah is very specific, and the word law has very clear connotations in our mind. So, the main point is still clear. However you read this, Hashem grants us righteousness. It is a gift, and we can't boast about it, about earning it or deserving it, because it's a gift. You don't ask, gift is something you receive, right? And you can't say, oh, look at me, I got this gift. Yes, ma'am.
Also because he's not giving us to be like we're 100% righteous. He's giving us his righteousness.
Right, his righteousness. It's really, he's giving us the merit. He's given us the merit of Yeshua. Remember, Yeshua earns that righteousness for us, and he happens to share. That's amazing. Now, that's a benefit, right? I mean, if I get a big cake and I decide to share it, you all benefit, right? That's the idea. We are benefiting. It's a gift. That's what it is. It's not something we earn. And that's the point he's making. Now, why is he making that? Because there are some confusions in the crowd. There are some people who have a slightly different teaching. Maybe they do not see the scriptures the same way. So Shaul wants to clear this out of their head, that which we get from God, righteousness, is a gift. It's not something we can boast about. Look at me, I'm righteous. Because we didn't really earn it. We didn't really deserve it. God just gave it to us. And that's amazing. So we should be thankful, essentially. So let's keep reading. Romans chapter 3, verses 29 through 30. It says, or is God of Jews only? Is he not the God of Gentiles also? Yes, of Gentiles also. Since indeed God, who will justify the circumcised by faith or by faithfulness, and the uncircumcised through faith or through faithfulness, is one. Now, you may remember a little while ago, I was teaching about the Shema. And when I was teaching about Shema, I actually took you to this verse in Shaul. Because I actually believe that what Shaul is thinking is the Shema when he writes this. God is one. Right? That is the fundamental principle of the Shema. And that one God has many people whom he chooses to justify in the same way, because he is one. Now, they are not one. They're all over the place. They're diverse. But God is one. And they're united in him. And the justification that happens, the process of being made righteous, is the same. It's a gift that he gives to one and to the other. Now, remember, I told you, we talked about the Shema and asked you a question, should non-Jews recite the Shema? Should that be something important to them? And I told you that, if God is truly one, that he's one God for the whole world, then maybe yes. And Shaul seems to think he is. So there's a unity that's being brought here, where is God not God of Jews only? Is he exclusive? No. He's God of the whole world. Gentiles also, he says. So he says he will justify the circumcised and the uncircumcised. All right? Now, what you might have noticed last time we talked about this passage when we discussed the Shema passages is how the terminology is different. He says he will justify the circumcised by faith or by faithfulness, and then circumcised through faith or through faithfulness. And what you see here is different prepositions. It is very tempting for us to look at this passage and suppose that the different prepositions by and preposition through, represent different means of justification. Some people have gone there that way, okay? That's what they've done. They've looked at it and say, look at the first case. It says ek pisteos. And then the second case is dia tes pisteos. So they're different grammatical cases, and they're different prepositions. So grammar is similar, but prepositions are different. And so people say, oh, okay, that means one group, the circumcised, gets justified one way, and the other group, the uncircumcised, get justified another way. And that's very tempting to go that way. But I'm going to remind you why you shouldn't. Because Shaul has just explained to you in the previous verses that justification is a gift from God. Okay, that's in verse 24 in the same chapter. That it is through redemption. And remember, redemption is not something you do to yourself. It's somebody else that does it to you. You're the recipient of redemption. And there is no distinction, he said, in verse 22. So, if he just said that there's no distinction, then why all of a sudden are we tempted to create a distinction in the verse that just follows? He just told you there's no difference. Jews, Gentiles, it's the same. God actually bestows this gift to you in the same kind of way, and you receive it in the same way by taking it and saying thank you. But now we want to say, oh, it's two different kinds of justification. So I'm saying resist the temptation of seeing two different ways of justifying. He says it's a gift, and it's through his grace, and you receive it through redemption. So what this is, and the reason why there's a little bit of a difference in these prepositions in Greek, is that it's poetic parallelism. It is very similar to the poetry that you see in Psalms. It's done for emphasis. You will see how a lot of times the book of Psalms will say one stanza, and they will repeat the same stanza by changing the words differently a little bit and altering the terminology just a little bit, but actually saying the same thing. Line 1 and line B have the same exact meaning, only they will be expressing that same meaning in two different ways. That's what's happening right here. So he's kind of getting poetic on us, essentially. That's what I'm trying to say. And so it's done for emphasis. It's done to create an effect. And that it's this emunah, this faith, or this faithfulness is the agent in both situations. That's what's important to understand. That we stand before God, being justified, being made righteousness, because of Yeshua's faithfulness. That's the idea. Our faith is one aspect, but his faithfulness is another. What we believe or don't believe, that's one aspect, but what he has done doesn't change what he has done, whether you and I believe it or not, by the way. That's a constant. And so this is where we get lost between these terms like faith and faithfulness. But emunah is a little bit more concrete, I guess, in Hebrew. So hopefully that will help you understand that this is the agent. So anyway, familiar verse, something that we've talked about just recently. I wanted to bring that up. It's right there. So, and now we're reading it in a much, much, much broader context as we study in the book of Romans. So, all right. So just as with the idea of spiritual circumcision, which Shaul introduced earlier, remember we talked about spiritual circumcision? One might think that physical is inferior and not needed. The same is true with faith versus obedience. People get caught in the same exact trap. Just because there's this circumcision done without hands, that, ooh, that's awesome, that's wonderful, that's spiritual, that's great. That somehow makes it seem better than this physical circumcision that the male has to perform with hands. And so I want to be circumcised by God. Well, I told you both are necessary. I gotta have both, really. So it's tempting to just kind of say, all right, I'm going to treat this dialogue the same way that I treat this circumcision dialogue. We've already determined that spiritual circumcision is better than physical, so now we're just going to just determine that faith is better than obedience. That's not what Shaul is saying. So, in case it's not clear to you, the faith, how faithfulness does not undermine the Torah, Shaul deliberately states that it actually affirms it, just in case anybody has gone off to the side. But of course, the people don't read this verse very much because they skip it over because there's some other good juicy stuff further down. So do we then nullify, he says in verse 31, do we nullify the law through faith? May it never be. On the contrary, we establish the law, or we establish the principle. Remember, now that you know that the word law can mean other things. Consider a possibility of generic meaning here versus specific meaning. So, do we nullify it through faith? No. On the contrary, we establish it. He says that because people are tempted to pit faith versus obedience. It's better to believe than to obey. Maybe you have heard this taught. Maybe not in such words that I'm proclaiming it to you point. Simple, but people will take all kinds of verses in the Bible and spin it to show to you that believing is somehow superior to actually obeying God. So let's break this down. Do we nullify? So Shaul says. So it says katar gomen. So you see that word erga. Erga means work, literally. So the term katargeo means to make something unproductive, powerless, or ineffective. So he says, do we do that? Do we nullify it? Do we make it powerless, unproductive? No, he says, we establish. We do histonomen. Histemi means to validate, to uphold, or literally to stand something upright. So these words are the opposites. But I want you to see, nullify and establish are two words that meant to be antonyms. They're the opposites. Torah is not nullified but established by the belief, or by faith, or by faithfulness. Do you see what I mean? Emunah does not undermine the Torah. It's the other way around. It establishes it. Now that's a very powerful point that a lot of theologians, frankly, who read Book of Romans miss, and I don't know why, but I guess it's the mindset with which they read it. Now this is very similar to when Yeshua said, I did not come to abolish but to fulfill the Torah. The fulfill is the opposite of abolish, but yet somehow people want to say that the word fulfill is the same as abolish.
Oh, yeah.
How many people spin that? But those are opposite words. These are opposite words. He says it does not nullify but it establishes. They have to mean the opposite. Here it's much more obvious and clear, but with the verses where Yeshua says I didn't come to abolish the law but fulfill it, people spin that one all day long because it's Greek again. It's all in the Greek. David, you have a point there?
I have a question for the Greek word there for establish.
Mm-hmm.
Would the Hebrew equivalent be hakim?
Yes.
Okay.
That would be one of the possible equivalents. And when I looked it up in the dictionary, I have this fantastic dictionary. It's a dictionary that's key to the Septuagint. So it allows me to see which words in the Greek Septuagint, and then knowing the original, I can relate to what does it say in Greek, what does it say in Hebrew, and kind of laying it out. So I have this fascinating dictionary that allows me to kind of trace those little. So yes, yakum, that's one of the root words that actually stands for histemi there. Yes, Josh.
I think just the receivers of this letter, is this written to Gentiles in Rome, or is it written to a synagogue of mixed people in Rome? I'm curious.
So you weren't here. You missed one of my early sessions, and I explained. I'll repeat that. It's okay. It bears repeating for other who may have missed it. So the letter of Romans is written to a mixed community of. These are congregations. These are home groups. These are little havras that Jews have established in Rome. Then Jews were expelled from Rome by the edict of the emperor. And so the only people who left, of course, behind are non-Jews. And then a few years later, they came back. The laws were changed. The emperor, I think, is gone now. New emperor, so the laws changed. They're allowed to come back. They come back, and they try to integrate themselves back into those communities they established, these little chavras, and they can't because everything has changed in the amount of those 10 years. And so what has changed is that there is no Torah, there is no wisdom, there's no consistent tradition. People have taken some of the teachings that they earlier on received and now have reinterpreted them. And now we have a conflict between Jews and non-Jews who actually are together on the foundation of Yeshua, but they are apart on how it all works together. And so Shaul is trying to reconcile both communities because both of them experiencing sort of an animosity toward another for different reasons. So, of course, Roman followers of Christ do not understand how Jews fit into this situation altogether because they've been fine without them for a few years, and now they're back and messing things up. So they don't understand how Jews fit into this congregation. And then, of course, the Jews don't understand how Gentiles can possibly function without them being there to begin with.
Yeah.
They're like, we have a disconnect. We have a misunderstanding, right? So hopefully that makes sense. So this is the kind of mess we have in the Roman community. And then Shaul says, I'm going to write a letter. I'm going to try to fix it. I'm going to try to help you both out. So sometimes he speaks words that are directed more to the Jewish population. And other times he speaks more to the non-Jewish population. And other times he speaks to both of them because it applies to both of them equally. So depending on what part of the letter we're reading or what segment we're reading, you can kind of have to assume and ask a question. Is he speaking to one, the other, or both jointly? And that will help you actually to interpret the context, because the context switches. He kind of switches his voice, because as he goes into a particular point or diatribe or a little rabbi trail, as I call it, he may just go off to the side, and then he comes back to that. So he will do this. There's rabbit trails and there's rabbi trails. Right? I'm glad you guys appreciate my humor stuff. So he will do that. And if you can read it with that mindset and follow, just don't, whatever you do, don't just say, okay, this is where it stops. Because it actually doesn't stop. I suggest a lot of times to people, if you really want to understand something, read it in one gulp. Seriously. Just read the whole thing in one gulp. Do not stop. Say, I have an hour. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to read it. I'm not going to stop until I begin to hear and then there. Because then you get the bird's eye view. And you can't start seeing those things out of context. Because you just heard the whole entire speech the person meant to say, rather than little portions. So a lot of times people will be hoodwinked that the person says something when they didn't say it if they take his words out of context. But you can't take them out of context because I just said read it all at one gulp. Right? So all of a sudden, it's a technique we use to avoid getting into an erroneous idea. Context is supremely important. Context is king. Your words can be taken out of context all day long and then misconstrued, and then that's not what you said, or at least that's not what you meant. Because you meant it in one way, but you now, out of context, they can be quoted and misconstrued in a completely different way. That's not fair. Not one of us likes when they do that with our words. And guess what? I don't think Paul likes it when we're doing it with his words, or anybody else for that matter.
I don't know if this is true, but I heard that somebody gave a message and said that when the letter was read, actually the person reading it could actually look, when they read part of it,
Yeah.
could actually look at the people. Okay, I'm
Yeah.
like literally,
Yeah.
I'm talking to you.
Right.
And then when they were reading the other, I'm talking to you, and then
Right.
I'm talking to everybody, but they knew each other, and it was directed specifically at some points. Everyone needed to listen, but it would be
You're right.
directed toward the specific.
You're right, Beverly. Most of the people experienced this letter not in reading it, they experienced it in hearing it. And this was read multiple times because guess what? It's not so easy to understand even in English or Greek, or trust me, this is not easy stuff. He's talking about quite complicated theological ideas. And sometimes they take time to wrap our minds around it. So, but as a teacher, he's going to distill these truths, and he does it in written form. Why? Because he wants us to have it preserved so that we can work through it later, which is what we're doing right now. So hopefully it makes sense. The idea of establishing and not nullifying is important. It's something that people miss, yes, Dan?
On that exact, what you just said, I find it particularly powerful because when you're nullifying something, think about it like as a building.
Mm-hmm.
You're either getting rid of that building or you're keeping that building in proper order. And that is really what he's saying. Mm-hmm. We are responsible personally. He says, you establish it. It's not, I will establish it or whatever. It's literally put in the people's hands that they have to take part in keeping it what it is.
By being faithful, by practicing our faith, let's put it that way, by practicing your belief, that's what being faithful can be understood as. We are establishing the Torah. We're propping it up. We're lifting it up high, and we say, V'zo da Torah, right? That's exactly what we're doing. We're lifting it up and saying, this is it. These are the words, and we're not going to say that they don't mean anything to us anymore. They do. That's an action. So anyway, I'm making analogies here, but I'm belaboring the point. So Romans chapter 3, verse 3. Shaul mentioned that Jewish unbelief or unfaithfulness, apistia. Remember we said pistis is faith, apistia means unbelief or lack of faith. Kind of like theism, atheism. So apistia. What does unbelief lead to? Shaul says it will not nullify the faithfulness of God. Pisintitheo. Faithfulness of God will not change even if people do not believe it. So an unbelief on the part of Israel, Shaul says in chapter 3, verse 3, is not going to change the fact that God is still going to be faithful because he is that kind of God. Now, there are people who will tell you that, oh, yes, it does, because Jews reject it, they're out. People preach that the other way around all day long, but that's not what Shaul says. Again, read it. It's there. It's in context. It says, unbelief will not nullify the faithfulness of God. In Romans 3:30, Shaul explains that justification from sin is a gift. It is by or through belief and faithfulness. And so by this belief, what we just read in verse 31, right, will not nullify the law. Do you see the parallelism in this? Do you see the idea that unbelief will not nullify the faithfulness of God? Okay? And faithfulness or faith will not nullify the Torah. These things are unchangeable. Even though it is very tempting for people to create a brand new theological idea that has not existed there, it is tempting. I say don't go there, because that's not what the text says.
May I ask a question? It's theological in nature. Through this, it seems as if that the idea, the promises made to the Jewish people are going to stand by Yeshua's faithfulness and not necessarily by the belief of the Jewish people.
Well, the belief of Jewish people is not going to change what God has promised.
That's my point. What I'm saying
There are always people who believe, and there's always people who don't believe. There's always a remnant. That's not going to.
So my question
Change
is that sounds like then the Jewish people are going to inherit the land. There's a place for them in the world to come,
Absolutely.
regardless of their perception or belief in Yeshua.
That's because that's God's faithfulness to His promises. What I choose to believe or not believe is not going to change. I'm not going to manipulate God into not being who He is or keeping His promises. Let's put it that way. There's nothing I can do or not do that will make Him change in who He is at the core. So my actions are, I say, out of that equation. I'm not a part of that equation, is what we're talking about. So yeah, it's a theological idea. Yes, Ms. Judy, you had a question or something?
No, I'm just going to say, God is a covenant-keeping God. He's not going to break His covenants.
No. His promises are His promises, and Shaul is going to talk about His word, His promises. And the whole next chapter is going to talk a lot about promises and word that God has given. Yes?
There is a standard that was set by the Torah, by the prophecy that Moses took and wrote down in the Torah, and that standard, it seems to be what Shaul was saying, is not changing.
No,
that standard never changed. Just because Rome dispelled the Jewish people and now they're coming back, that standard stays the same.
Right. But you can understand how in the mind of a Roman who has experienced something different for the last few years, they may be tempted to think that it has, because they were fine 15 years ago.
I'm just going to state the obvious. I mean, the whole Tanakh is, you mess up, but I'm faithful. I'm
Right.
going to do it because of my promises, for the sake of my name.
Yeah.
I don't change. He's saying.
That is the mercy upon which we stand. Every time, all day long, and on Yom Kippurim, that is what we say. The content of our prayers. The verses we quote to God are the same exact words that He's given us. And that's again, if that's your practice, if that's what you do, then you understand that. But not everyone is in that spiritual boat, so to say. And because of that, these things need to be said. That's because of that, the book of Romans, this letter of Romans exists, because not everyone understood these ideas that maybe for you it's more fundamental, but for somebody else, that's a different way of thinking.
I'm a social studies teacher, and I'm currently teaching 7th graders. And in the district curriculum, it actually lays out that the Jews were replaced by the Christians.
Yeah, because of
Like
who wrote
it-
the curriculum.
It's in the curriculum to say this, and I'm like,
Oh, this is actually a standard teaching, and so I can point to you even to Jewish commentaries in the New Testament who would say the same things, because Jews who studied Paul from Christians would actually believe that Paul said what he said. I said, you know what? Learn how to read Greek. Go a little deeper. Stop relying on translations. Read it in context. Do not buy the whole Megillah, okay? Just don't, study for yourself. I mean, look, we're reading this verse by verse, right? I can't possibly mislead you or take you out of context because we're literally going through this verse by verse. And it's difficult because it's there. And so when I sit down with people to go through it verse by verse, they have to see what they have to see because it either is there or it's not. And other ideas that we want to kind of lay over this, unfortunately, they're very harmful. They bring a lot of harm. I want to show you another passage. So here we are. We made it to chapter 4. Can you believe it? Chapter 4. I don't know if I can get through chapter 4 today, but we can still get into it. Chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. He starts explaining it to you. Remember I told you Paul will get into these ideas where he will say a point and then he will belabor it for a little while, kind of chewing on it and letting people think through different implications of it. So he says, what then shall we say? And this is his what if. This is the hypothetical part of the letter. He's going to say, all right, let's take this thinking. Well, does that work? Let's take that thinking. Does that work? What shall we say? Abraham, our forefathers, according to the flesh, has found. For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. So he quotes the Torah right there. So this is one of those passages that I told you where people take a wrong turn because they actually think that the Torah teaches that justification by works was some kind of a way to go. And then out comes this new teaching in Christianity that tells you justification by faith is the new way to go. That's not what Shaul is saying. He's saying from the beginning of time, he's going to go into this hypothetical. There is no such thing as justification for works. That's really the point. But he's going to play as if there is such a thing. He's going to pretend as if this is real. He's going to play the hypothetical example. So he says, if there's such thing, how did Abraham get it? It says it was credited to him as righteousness. Look like that. It says, V'haimi ba'Adonai, so he believed right there. It says in Hebrew, and he believed in the Lord. V'chashvechu lo tzedakah, and it was accounted. Chashbon, chashav is the same word we get for receipt. Chashbon is receipt, an accounting. And it was accounted to him, or accounted towards him, or credited towards him. That's how we would translate it. If I was doing a very modern translation, it says it was credited to him as tzedakah, as righteousness, or Greek dekasuni. So he's going to play on these ideas now, explaining that, hey, Abraham, he believed, and God said, okay, you're righteous. Why? Because you believe in me, because of the kind of life that he lived. Now, to the one who works, the wage is not credited as a favor, right? Hopefully you don't say to your employer, thank you for that gift this week. I worked for it 40 hours. I'm so grateful for the gift. But as is due. But to the one who does not work, but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is credited as righteousness. Just as David also speaks of the blessing on the man to whom God credits righteousness apart from works. So he believes that David spoke of that as well. Whether you believe it or not, I don't know, but Shaul is going to say that, according to him, David did say that. And then he quotes Psalm, blessed are those whose lawless deeds have been forgiven, and whose sins have been covered. Now, you can read Psalm 32 if you wish, but it says, blessed is the man whose sin the Lord will not take into account. That is a gift. God can hold you to your sin, what he's saying. But blessed is the man for whom God says, I'm not going to. Now, is that a present? Is that a gift? Is that God saying, you owe me, but I'm not going to collect? You see what I mean? Yeah. Blessed is the man whose sin the Lord will not take into account. He's not going to hold him accountable for that. So, Hebrew, says the same thing. He just quotes Psalm 32 to make a point, again, that there is such thing as righteousness outside of Torah. Remember, this is how he began. Earlier in chapter 1 and chapter 2, he says, there is such thing as righteousness that's outside of the Torah. The Torah and the prophets speak of it. They testify of it, but it's not in it. And that righteousness outside of Torah is how the people can be justified even if they don't know the Torah. Now that's a big theological idea. But now he continues developing that same idea. So there's Romans chapter 4, 4 through 8. So we keep reading. What I believe he bases this on, and what I think is in the mind of Shaul when he reads these verses, when he thinks about these, is a passage in Nehemiah 9, 7 through 9. In fact, we pray this on Shabbat morning. This is part of Shachrit service, verbatim. It says, "You are the Lord God who chose Avram and brought him out of the Ur of the Chaldees, and you gave him the name Avraham. You found his heart faithful before you. You made a covenant with him to give to him the land of Canaanite, the Hittite, the Amorite, Perizzite, Jebusite, and Girgashite, to give to his descendants. And you have fulfilled your promise because you are righteous." Like I said, it's straight out of the Siddur. We use the same exact quote in the Siddur, in the morning prayers. And the idea is that God found Abram's heart faithful. His faith. His belief, because he believed and it was accounted to him as righteousness. He looked at his heart, he found it faithful, and it says he fulfilled his promise because God is righteous. That's what he does. So he made a promise to Abraham, he fulfilled it. But his heart was right. That's an important point that Nehemiah makes. And Shaul is going to go to that very idea, to that very point. There's something else about Abraham that's really important. He says, "Is this blessing then on the circumcised or on the uncircumcised also?" For we say, faith was credited to Abraham as righteousness. How then was it credited? While he was circumcised or uncircumcised? Not while circumcised, while uncircumcised. And he received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness of faith, which he had while uncircumcised, so that he might be the father of all who believe without being circumcised, that righteousness might be credited to them. So there's that merit being passed on. And then the father of circumcision to those who not only are the circumcision, but also follow in the steps of faith of our father Abraham, which he had while uncircumcised. So, all of this discussion about the word circumcised, which appears at least 15 times in this verse or something like that, seems like a lot, is really talking about how was this faithfulness credited? How did Abraham was deemed to be righteous? And the fact is, he was uncircumcised. Essentially, somebody would say, if you're an uncircumcised, you're a Gentile. So, like, here it is, Abraham. And then later on, Abraham becomes circumcised. But when that transaction happens between him and the Lord, when that happens, at that point, he's not circumcised yet. And only later, Hashem makes a covenant with him, and only later circumcision comes. So what Shaul does with that is that he says, look, all of you Romans who are listening to me right there up, you're kind of in that position. Maybe you're uncircumcised, but guess what? That righteousness outside of the Torah that I've been talking about, that's it right there, working its magic in the life of Abraham. He was not circumcised. He was in the same position as you are, and yet God accounted to him as righteousness, his faith. So why can't an average Roman, being uncircumcised, not really even knowing the Torah, can also find that same justifying righteousness? That's what he's saying. That's a big picture. That's a big idea that he's trying to paint. And he's trying now, if you haven't noticed, he just switched the audience, right? That passage is more for the people who are listening to him who are not circumcised, because Jews, they're pretty certain in their position. They know God has chosen us, he's called us, made us promises, we have all this stuff. But what about everybody else? Well, he says, guess what? You also have a very special thing. Why? Because of that special righteousness that is outside of the Torah. And then he uses an example of Abraham in his state of being uncircumcised, receiving that benefit. So, that's the idea. That if this can happen before, this can happen again. A very complicated, long set of sentences, but hopefully it makes sense what he's trying to say. Yes?
Pardon me, but it seems like he's talking only to men throughout.
Oh, yeah.
women not,
Yeah.
what was women's role, or they didn't have the role, or just never any part of it?
They did, but obviously the visuals, okay, the circumcision is something tangible, visual. It's it's a sign. It's something much more tangible. So back in those days, women converted to Judaism a lot more, by the way, for the same very reason. The circumcision actually had a massive stigma in the Roman society. It's like, it was terrible. It was awful. To a Roman, if a person was circumcised, it's like they just chose to mutilate themselves purposefully. That's how they saw it. Because Romans extolled nakedness and naked bodies. If you notice, every Roman statue is naked, and every time the parts are showing prominently, right? They were very proud of those parts. And honestly, that's how they felt. That was a cultural thing. And for me to take and modify those parts would be to mutilate what God has done so perfectly. So people don't get it. I just say, I'm just going to put it this way. People don't get it. And that's okay that they don't get it. But this circumcision is something of a stumbling block for non-Jews in the Roman world. And Paul talks a lot about it in his letters, actually, because it is such a issue. It's such a problem. It's not so much a problem for Jews. They're okay with it. They don't remember. It was on the 8th day. But for Romans, this is a stumbling block. It's something that they have to deal with. So we'll talk about it. You're right, Arlene. He does talk a lot. It sounds like he talks to men. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
So, wasn't one of the backdrops of this that Peter and Paul were kind of duking it out over this, so to speak?
That's what people would want you to think.
Not really.
No.
Really?
They were on the same
Where did that
page.
get-
They might have had different views on certain aspects of halakha, but actually they were not at odds with each other. There are a group of theologians out there that want you to think that Peter and Paul had a fight. And the rest of the letters are kind of them working it out. Guess what? Big, fat, juicy lie. Just forget it. Forget that you believed it. Take it out of your mind, because they're not. They're not on the different pages. They're not competing with each other. There's no competition. Shaul submits himself to the authority in Jerusalem. He comes to Jerusalem in the book of Acts, and he says, I submit to you my gospel. The things I preach, the things I teach in places like Galatia, I submit it to you. Look at it. Examine it. Should I not be saying this? And then Shaul says, and they gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship. Means they affirmed us. They believed in everything we said. They agreed with us. So Shaul humbly submitted himself to the authority of the Jerusalem elders, of whom Peter was one, by the way.
Right.
Peter, James, they were in the room. Okay, remember, they are the people, they're the apostles. They're the ones who are there. They're the ones who will be Yeshua on the mountain, right? They were the closest ones. And he says, I submit this to you. Tell me if I'm doing something wrong. And they said, no. They accepted it. In fact, they said, how about you take a letter with you to anybody who doubts you, and this is what you should say. And then the whole entire Acts scenario where they actually write a draft a letter. So people want you to pretend that Peter and Paul were, people want you to pretend that Peter and Paul were in some kind of fight. No, that's not the case. That if you throw that out of your mind, it might help you to read the New Testament a little bit better. The reason why people say that, and I'll explain why, is because they want to say that Peter was pro-Torah and Paul was anti-Torah. And the truth is, they're both pro-Torah.
Correct.
But people want to spin Paul as anti-Torah. And therefore, they need the opposition. They need the Peter and Paul to have a fight and disagreement. Because Peter is clearly 100% pro-Torah all the time. Never Peter says anything. We have no records of Peter saying something that somebody could spin in some very questionable way and say, see, he's telling us that we don't need to observe any of that stuff. Faith is superior to circumcision. Faith is superior to obedience. We just need to believe, and that's all we need. Like, obedience is not important, and I just shove it all out. Because that's how people are going to spin Romans. That's how they're going to spin Paul. So they need Peter and Paul not to agree. I'm sorry, that's an old theological fight that really has nothing to do with any of us.
What's interesting about that is even anti-missionaries in Judaism believe that lie.
Of course they do.
Like Tovia Singer buys that hook, line, and
Yes.
sinker.
And
it's
he
an
will teach that
argument.
all day long.
Yeah, and it's
You know
a-
why? Because he read all those same commentaries that I read by these nice people who studied the stuff. But you know, that's why I said study the Greek, make up your own mind.
In Peter's letter, he actually affirms Paul. He said, "Our brother Paul teaches that," and some people misinterpret it to be
Right.
or
He says the stuff he teaches is really hard to understand.
That he supports Paul. He's
Yeah.
very nice about it.
Yeah, I want you to realize there's no argument, there's no fight between them. There are parties who are interested in them having two different versions of Christianity. They said, you will hear this among theologians, Pauline Christianity and Petrine Christianity. Both of them didn't exist. I'm telling you a secret. Neither existed. There was no such thing. In fact, there was no Christianity at that point.
Correct.
But you see what I'm saying? There were no two different assemblies. There were no two types, not two ways. The way of Peter and the way of Paul. No, it's just that people are trying to create these theological paradigms, which they will later use to spin these letters of the apostles in a way that they want to spin them. I'm sorry, I don't want to sound like it's nefarious that they have some kind of ulterior motives, but I think sometimes people want to defend what they want to defend, and they want to stand in what they believe, and they will sometimes stretch things to make it work.
Little, not a rabbit trail, but, can you just quickly explain, I mean, there is the one, section where Paul rebukes Peter publicly for sinning with Gentiles.
Sure.
So, I think it would be helpful if you explain.
I'll give you a 2 to 3 minute explanation of that. So that's in the book of Galatians. It's a story that Paul tells to prop up his apostolic authority. If you read it in context, he says, I don't take my, cues from anybody. I will stand up for the truth. I'll stand up to anyone. Basically, that's what he says. And then he cites that example. He says, when I came to Antioch, Peter, he was not eating with Gentiles. Why? Well, because some visitors came from Jerusalem and they decided that they don't want to do it. So Peter said, okay, we'll just eat apart. We'll just eat together, And he says, I called him on it. I called Peter out. That's what Paul says, right? You know what that does? It establishes his authority as a person of truth and integrity. He says, I will stand up even to the person I admire. If I think they're wrong, I'm going to stand up to them. I admire Peter, but I called him on his inconsistency. He walked away from Gentiles. He did not eat with them. And I called him to it. And then, of course, later, Peter, he listened to him. That's the story. Like, he says, oh, yeah, you're right. Maybe I should not have done it. But it doesn't matter. It's an occasion of Peter doing what Peter thought was right. And Paul comes in and he says, and I called him on it. And in the end, it all worked out because guess what? Peter went on back sharing the table with non-Jews. Guess what? He's done it before. He's done it with Cornelius, right? So that happened chapters before. So it's like all of a sudden, you have this idea. I don't want you to think of, again, that being a fight. I want you to realize that that story is told by Paul not to put down Peter, but to prop himself up, to say that, hey, I'm the kind of an apostle who will take on even the big guys. The people I admire, the people I look up to, I'll take them on if I feel they're wrong. And then he says all that to prop his authority because he does that in the opening of the book of Galatians because he's going to tell them, I tell you, don't get circumcised. He's going to make a very strong halakhic pronouncement, and he says, I do that on the authority that I have, and I will not tell you, lies because I'm that kind of a person. I'll stand up to people. That's how that story is. So it's not the story, it's the reason why that story is being told that's very important in the book of Galatians. Because it's not being told to highlight that there's some kind of a conflict between Peter and Paul. Make sense?
Was that a cultural thing? I mean, what, a rabbinical thing? Why can't Jews and Gentiles?
Sometimes people like to toot their own horn. Sometimes people like to
No, I mean,
tell you why they should be heard and listened to, and sometimes people like to tell you why you should pay attention to what they have to say.
I meant the eating together.
Oh, the eating together. Yeah, that was an issue. So number one, somebody came from Jerusalem. We don't know who these people were. So people, it says people came from Jerusalem from James. Like, we don't know who these people are. So it could have been a group of priests or Sadducees or rabbis. I don't know who it was. Like somebody came from Jerusalem, and they were in Antioch. And so Paul was going to show hospitality to them, but they were not comfortable eating with Gentiles. We don't know, because Jews generally did not do that. That was not a normal thing for Jews to do. They felt that there was, okay, most Gentiles the Jews ever known were idolaters. These Gentiles in Antioch were not. But they didn't know that. As far as they were concerned, you guys are kind of crossing the line, eating with idolaters. So we are not comfortable with that. So they said, we don't want to. So I assume that Peter just said, okay, fine, we'll do this separately. Your visitors, your guests, accommodate guests, right? And then after these people are gone, everything is back to normal. But for that moment, to accommodate the guests, he had to make an adaptation. Now, Paul, calls him on that adaptation, saying that's inconsistent, that's not right. What you did by doing so is you showed to the Gentiles that somehow they're lesser. And Peter probably said, yeah, you're right. I messed up. I should not have done that. But in the moment, that's the decision I made. And that was decision again to what? To accommodate my guests. So things like that, there's a lot going on culturally there. There are social and cultural realities that we don't fully understand because we live in a world that's different. We don't live in a world where non-Jews are pagans. We don't face the same difficulty today, where I'm sitting down at the table to eat with them and they're actually an idol worshiper. I don't have that problem today, right? So it's kind of simplified for me. But for them, that was a very real reality for them. So anyway, all right, I have to stop. We're running out of time. Sorry. We are where we are. Great discussions, great questions. Awesome.